Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Nigel Cameron. He's a historian and ethicist, and he's the author of the book, Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. There's an excerpt from that book on Kevin MD titled, See Everett Koop's Fearless Fight Against the Tobacco Industry. Nigel, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
All right. So just to briefly share your story and tell us a little bit about the excerpt that you decided to share with us today.
Well, obviously, I'm a Brit, as you can still tell from my accent. I spent almost 30 years stateside. In the process, I got to know Koop back from the mid-'80s on. And so I ended up working on the book because I just discovered just a few years, but just before COVID hit, that nobody was writing a biography. So that's a quick version of how I came to be doing this. And what interested me in the book, of course, was partly the number of different things he got involved with, his many lives. But the excerpt about tobacco is very interesting because it was very deliberate.
Mhm.
In some ways, he was politically naive, but sometimes he could be very smart. It was a curious almost sort of bipolar thing he had. And this was very smart. And, he was trashed by everybody when he was being confirmed as Surgeon General because he was conservative, he was pro-life, he wasn't a public health person, he was a pediatric surgeon. The one thing the Surgeon General had to do, the only thing, was to sign off on this smoking report every year. Didn't write it, but he signed off on it. And so he sat around working out how to use that to get himself back in the picture and get rid of all this stuff. And it worked because the press fell over him because the press hated big tobacco, and so did he.
So give us the context in terms of the history behind just signing off on this legislation and the opportunity that this presented to Dr. Koop.
Well, when he was nominated, well, he was fingered for the job back in early 1981 after Reagan came into power. The actual confirmation took about 9 months for various reasons. Finally, he was confirmed, interestingly, even with a majority of Democrats voting for him. But he was very unpopular. And the public health people were very much against his appointment.
Mhm.
And he'd inherited, the Surgeon General's job until the mid 1960s was enormously important. It's astonishing looking back. He was in charge of the NIH, of CDC, of
Mhm.
FDA, all that stuff was reporting to the Surgeon General. Under Lyndon Johnson, the role was stripped of all those responsibilities. And they were all made to report separately in HHS. The Surgeon General ends up with about 5 staff on a travel budget to go around making speeches. Koop, when he's first approached about the job, thinks he'll be in the cabinet. Surgeon General's never been in the cabinet,
Mhm.
but he thinks this is a real big job, and then discovers there's not much to it. But the one thing that remained was the anti-smoking role, and so that was the one thing he really began to work on.
Tell us about the tobacco climate and the politics around it during that time in the early 1980s.
Well, for a long time, the US had, earlier Surgeon General had produced reports on tobacco. There was this feeling that tobacco should be constrained, it was a bad thing. And Koop himself was a pipe smoker, into the 70s. So he wasn't a sort of natural anti-tobacco person, but he became persuaded. And yet, big tobacco was enormously powerful, very powerful in Congress. Jesse Helms, who was, I call him the patron saint of big tobacco, he was one of Koop's major backers because he was also a social conservative. And tobacco smoking in the US, it was somewhere in the mid 30%. Had
Mhm.
been it been going down a little, but it was still high like that. And there was a kind of gentlemanly rivalry, one writer put it, between big tobacco and the US government on this issue. And that same writer went on to say that Koop turned that through one press conference into all out war and really changed the dynamic of a major US industry and its relation to the US government.
Well, take us back in time to that press conference. You wrote that it's on February 22nd, 1982. So tell us the events leading up to that historic press conference.
Well, Koop had only been confirmed for about 3 months. This was pretty new. And his boss, Brand, who was the assistant secretary, who was responsible for all the FDA, NIH, and all that kind of stuff, and who in fact had not really supported Koop's nomination because he thought the job was an anachronism. It was really his deal.
Mhm.
And he came in and presented the report and then called on his subordinate, the Surgeon General, to make a sort of follow-up speech, sort of second toast. And Koop, big guy, booming voice, immediately dominates the proceedings. And he makes this very powerful speech saying there will be irreparable loss to the United States, huge economic damage, and so on and so forth, because of all these things that we can prove that tobacco does. And of course, the tobacco industry had kept saying, well, you can't prove causal connections, it's just correlations, we don't really know, and so on. And Koop, he became contemptuous. And I
Mm.
think it was his contempt for the industry that has as much to do with his impact as the actual arguments he used. And well, as I say in the book, I mean, you look at the Washington Post and the New York Times for the next day. I mean, he's on the front page, his pictures all over the place. I think in one of them, his boss, Brand, his name isn't referred to until 3 paragraphs down. In another one, it's not till 6 paragraphs down. I mean, Koop is in. And Koop really had changed the dynamic, not simply of the tobacco debate, but of the role of the Surgeon General within HHS. I mean, this person with this random little office was now a major player because, of course, politics is ultimately all about the press and perception.
Now, was this the first time that such a public figure had such a like you said, contemptuous, a direct opposition to the tobacco industry in such a theatrical manner?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, certainly in a theatrical manner. I mean, earlier Surgeons General, in fact, several of them had been quite active on this front. I mean, people often forget how far back actual evidence of the harms of tobacco go. 1952, Reader's Digest published a famous article called Cancer by the Carton. I mean, so this had been going for a long time, but it was gentlemanly. I mean, there were reports, there were debates, things were kept down. I mean, there are pictures, of people writing Surgeon General reports, all sitting around in conference rooms with ashtrays all over the table. At one point, there are 4 officials testifying before Congress. I mean, NIH sort of people,
Hmm.
every one of whom actually was a smoker, even if they were giving evidence against tobacco. So it was a situation of a high degree of tolerance. Looking back, it seems strange, like these things do, but like looking back on, back in the 50s and 60s, having no seatbelts in cars, notions of risk were handled very differently. And Koop, well, one of his greatest strengths, which runs throughout his life and throughout the book, ends up also as one of his greatest weaknesses, but it's his ego. He had an enormous ego. And when you're a pediatric surgeon, that really helps. When you get into politics, it maybe doesn't, but sometimes it did. And on this one occasion, this 1 hour in a press conference, Koop was really organized and he changed many things. And of course, during his time in office, during those 8 years, around 8 years, smoking dropped in the US by almost 25%.
Wow.
And you can track it, decade by decade. And this was far bigger drop than earlier and following decades. And the tobacco industry was huddling together, having their sort of secret to trying to work out what to do about this, because Koop really had made a difference. And a lot of it was his personality and his booming voice and his ego, which kind of comes across in these encounters.
So you mentioned that the day after this historic press conference, he made the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post. What was some of the public reaction to his press conference?
Well, I think that there was shock. I mean, there was just shock. I mean, the press were delighted because they, for all sorts of reasons, were against big tobacco. I'm sure these journalists were still smoking, but I mean, this was a target. I mean, this was big industry with a lot of issues of subvention, government underwriting tobacco farmers, and so on and so forth. An obvious target for the generally rather liberal press. And so there was a deep concern. I mean, that all of a sudden this industry was under threat. And this industry, of course, was politically very powerfully connected. Interestingly, Koop says that Jesse Helms, who was their patron saint on the Hill, actually, he and Koop stayed very friendly on a personal level for quite a long time. This didn't always happen. Koop could be very fractious and fall out with people. That relationship apparently survived, but immediately the tobacco industry was under huge pressure. And then, of course, you run through a few years and you have this effort to produce, this big deal with them, which would have removed liability from the tobacco industry. And they would have paid a huge amount of money to the states to cover costs of Medicaid, Medicare, and so on. But of course, that would all have been built into their pricing strategy. So it would have been a brilliant insurance deal for the industry. It finally didn't work out then. But Koop had put the ball in play. And then if you go forward 8-10 years, he and David Kessler running this committee called the Koop Kessler Committee, the 2K, trying to do some sort of broad deal in which essentially big tobacco is on the outs in American public life.
So after this press conference, you said big tobacco huddled up, decided what to do next. So what eventually was their response?
Well, they interestingly, we have all these minutes of their secret meetings and so on, which I went into. First of all, they really want to go after people, really hard, who've come out taking his kind of view in the political realm. At the same time, Koop said that he was more than once invited to secret meetings to try and sound him out for seeing what his price is. We don't have other evidence of that, but he said he had had several approaches of that kind. At the same time, of course, the issue really was one of litigation in the States. And in parallel with that, of efforts to, obviously, we have the health warnings, which were already there. They were going to get more serious. There were big debates about advertising, on television advertising, and whether that should be continued. At one point, rather curiously, because of the so-called fairness doctrine in the U.S. media, for every 3 ads that were shown by the tobacco companies, they had to show a free ad which was anti-smoking.
Mm-hmm.
And the dynamics of this worked their way through the system. And in fact, the tobacco companies ultimately agreed to withdraw from television advertising, partly, some suspect, because the anti-smoking ads, which were required, were doing damage to them. And they would prefer not to be exposed like that. But it was Koop who really ratcheted the whole thing up and put it on that level.
So now that Koop had this proverbial bully pulpit that now garnered so much attention, increased the power of the Surgeon General, after that press conference and after his confrontation with Big Tobacco, how did he leverage that platform afterwards?
He had a series of projects. One of the things Koop says is that because he spent so long waiting to be confirmed, he had a lot of time on his hands. He overdid it a bit because he was really quite busy, but just think out what you can do as Surgeon General when you really have almost no actual power, but you can make speeches. And there's a phrase, we use in Washington, the power to convene. You can get people together, and that really can make a difference. So he dreamed up this notion of what he called Surgeon General workshops. And Koop did everything with great sort of flair. These were Surgeon General workshops. These basically were, day and a half, 2-day conferences. And he did 7 or 8 of these over his time in office. And he'd just get all the key players together. And so, for example, he obviously was getting into AIDS later on, but he was looking at handicap issues. He was looking at domestic violence issues. Ultimately, he was looking at drunken driving. He was pushed into that. But he had this notion that you organize a meeting, you pull people together, you have some sort of federal advisory group working on it. There's a little cost involved, but not much. And you could have a press conference. Or in one case, at the end of the workshop, everybody went and testified on Capitol Hill. And he put his imprimatur on these things. And so he could have these stories running, which required not a lot in the way of staff support and funding, but because his name was on, they would get press. And he bundled together a whole series of issues. For example, this notion of self-help groups. He did a whole workshop on self-help groups. And it's worth looking at these stories because they show ways in which his sort of soft power was put to really very good use as he assembled these groups. And I think he was said by one writer talking about the domestic abuse issue, who said basically it was Koop who turned this into a public health issue.
Mm.
It was simply regarded as a criminal sort of issue, but it was also a public health issue because he framed the question and brought the players together.
So this event happened more than 40 years ago. And as I'm talking to you about now and learning about it, how should we remember this event in the proper historical context?
I think one way to look at the significance of what Koop did, exposing the tobacco companies, it was his honesty, the rigor of his thinking and his scientific honesty. The story is that, a certain gentleman would sign this thing. He didn't write it. There was a big department at HHS wrote these documents. He wasn't even in charge of it. And so as a guy called Don Shopland, who is still around and recently edited a book about these debates, Shopland was the guy sent along to help him with the report and say, well, this is where you sign. And he said he got into Koop's office, and this big document, hundreds of pages, he annotated it page by page by page. He had questions. And Shopland said if there was ever a press conference where a guy really knew his shit, it was that press conference. So it was the thoroughness, it was his attention to detail, his scientific honesty in a political environment in which then, of course, now is even more fun. But I mean, in which typically people have briefing papers, they have talking points, talkers, everything is summarized. But Koop wanted to get to the facts. He was concerned about the detail. And it was partly because he knew his onions, but he was taken so seriously. And that event set in motion the kind of role for him, which really is extraordinary, and which there are very few examples in American public life of a tiny office basically becoming highly significant. I mean, toward the end of the 80s, the pollsters say Koop was the second best known member of the US government after Ronald Reagan.
We're talking to Nigel Cameron. He's the author of the book, Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. His excerpt from that book is on Kevin MD. See Everett Koop's fearless fight against the tobacco industry. Nigel, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Well, Washington is in an interesting state at the moment. Notions of science, notions of integrity, notions of, people cowering because of political pressures on them. Koop, partly because God gave him this ego, was protected from a lot of that. And he was a man whose integrity was on the line every time and who was really quite fearsome. And he would have happily lose his job rather than be made to do something he thought wasn't right. And for a time, that made him a very powerful figure in Washington. And we need people like that in public science.
Nigel, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Good to be here.